past due." Emily Carter stared at the red letters stamped across the electricity bill, the third one this month, threatening disconnection. Outside, the November wind rattled the windows of the small apartment she could barely afford, a cruel reminder of the approaching winter. Her fingers trembled slightly as she placed the bill atop the growing stack on the kitchen counter, a paper tower of mounting debts and fading hope. 3 years since the Marine Corps officers had appeared at her doorstep, their faces solemn, their words shattering her world. 3 years since James had made the ultimate sacrifice in a distant desert, leaving behind only medals, memories, and a void no military pension could fill. The apartment walls were adorned with his photographs. James in his dress blues, James holding their newborn son, James, laughing by the lake on their last vacation together. Each frame held a moment frozen in time, fragments of happiness from a life that seemed to belong to someone else now. Before we jump back in, tell us where you are tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you are subscribed. Because tomorrow I have saved something extra special for you. Mom, is everything okay? 8-year-old Jake stood in the doorway, his small frame silhouetted against the hallway light. He had his father's eyes, perceptive, concerned, wise beyond their years. Emily quickly wiped away the tear that had escaped down her cheek. "Everything's fine, sweetie, just grown-up stuff." She forced a smile, one she had perfected over the years, bright enough to convince her son, but not quite reaching. Her tired eyes, her phone alarm chirped, a 15-minute warning before her next shift. Emily had 20 minutes to get Jake to the neighbor's apartment and make the 15-block walk to Riverside Diner, where she'd serve coffee and burgers until midnight. Then home for 5 hours of sleep before her morning shift at the convenience store. 2 jobs, endless hours, and still barely treading water. "Get your backpack, honey. Mrs. Wilson is waiting." Emily knelt down, straightening Jake's collar. "And remember, do my homework before video games," Jake finished, his voice a mixture of exasperation and understanding that no child his age should possess. He wrapped his small arms around her neck, burying his face in her shoulder. "Love you, Mom. Love you more," she whispered, the familiar knot tightening in her throat. The walk to the diner was bitter cold, wind slicing through her worn jacket as streetlights flickered to life against the darkening sky. Emily's mind wandered as her feet carried her forward on autopilot. James would have turned 34 next month. Would his hair have started graying at the temples like his father's had? Would the laugh lines around his eyes have deepened? The neon Riverside Diner sign buzzed overhead as Emily pushed through the glass door, the bell jingling her arrival. The warmth inside was a momentary comfort, the smell of grease and coffee a familiar constant in her ever-shifting world. "You're cutting it close, Carter," Frank, the manager, called from behind the counter, tapping his watch. "Table 7's been waiting." Emily nodded, slipping her coat onto the rack and tying her apron with practiced efficiency. No time for weakness, no space for grief. The uniform went on, and with it, the mask of resilience she wore every day. 8 hours on her feet, smiling through exhaustion, calculating tips that would determine if Jake got new winter boots this month. This was her life now, a relentless cycle of work and worry, of longing and loss. But each night when she finally collapsed onto her bed, Emily would touch the wedding band still hanging from a chain around her neck and whisper into the darkness, "We're making it, James, one day at a time." Because giving up wasn't an option, not when those perceptive eyes, so like his father's, were watching, learning what it meant to carry on when the weight of the world pressed down upon your shoulders. Not enough. The words hung in the air of Parkside Grocery, sharp and final, Emily Carter paused, her hands frozen mid-motion as she placed a small carton of milk, the cheapest brand, onto the conveyor belt. Her grocery cart held the bare essentials: pasta, canned vegetables, the day-old bread from the discount rack. Every item carefully selected, every price mentally calculated before it went into her cart. 3 checkout lanes over, an elderly man stood rigid, his weathered hands trembling slightly as they hovered over his modest pile of groceries. His fingers, knotted with arthritis, moved with deliberate dignity as he reached for his wallet again. "I'm sorry, sir," the cashier repeated, her voice tinged with genuine discomfort. "You're still $12.47 short." The man wore a faded navy jacket, its fabric threadbare at the elbows, but meticulously clean. A small worn pin gleamed on the lapel, Marine, Corps insignia, the eagle, globe, and anchor catching the fluorescent light. Emily recognized it instantly. James had worn the same symbol with unwavering pride. "I understand," the man replied, his voice quiet but clear, carrying the unmistakable weight of someone accustomed to maintaining composure through worse storms than this. "Let me put some things back." With methodical care, he began removing items from his small pile. First a carton of eggs, then a package of coffee, finally reaching for a bottle of prescription medication. Each item set aside with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime making difficult choices. Emily's throat tightened. The scene before her unfolded like a mirror to her own life. The careful calculations, the silent dignity of doing without. But something about the man's ramrod-straight posture, the way he squared his shoulders even in defeat, stirred a memory of James standing tall, even when the world seemed determined to bring him to his knees. "Wait," Emily called out, abandoning her cart. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she approached the register. The rational part of her brain screamed that she couldn't afford this, not with Jake's school field trip payment due tomorrow, not with the electricity bill threatening disconnection. But some decisions transcended logic. "I'll cover the difference," she said, pulling crumpled bills from her purse, money earmarked for next week's gas. The cashier's eyebrows lifted slightly, but she accepted the cash without comment. The elderly man turned, his steel blue eyes meeting Emily's. They were clear and sharp, windows to a soul that had witnessed things most would never comprehend. "Ma'am, that's not necessary," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had once given orders that determined life or death. "I insist," Emily replied, offering a smile that reached her eyes for the first time in days. "My husband was a Marine. He would have done the same." Something flickered across the man's face, recognition, perhaps, of the unspoken brotherhood that extended beyond service members to encompass the families who waited, worried, and sometimes, like Emily, were left behind. "Tom Reynolds," he said finally, extending a hand that bore the calluses of both war and work. "1st Marine Division, Vietnam." "Emily Carter," she replied, taking his hand. The grocery store faded away, and for a brief moment she felt James's presence, as though he were standing just behind her shoulder, nodding in approval. As Tom gathered his groceries, including the items he'd set aside, Emily noticed a single can of soup rolling back on the conveyor belt. Chicken noodle, the same brand her son Jake asked for when he was feeling under the weather. Without thinking, she added it to Tom's bag. "For a rainy day," she said softly. Tom Reynolds stood a little straighter, shoulders squared by something more substantial than pride. In his eyes, Emily saw a flicker of something she recognized from her own mirror, the relief of being seen, of having one's dignity preserved, if only for a moment. "Semper Fi, Mrs. Carter," he said quietly. "Your husband chose well." As they parted ways in the parking lot, Emily watched Tom's careful steps toward a rusted pickup truck. Her own groceries would be fewer tonight. Her budget stretched beyond its limits. But as she started her car, the weight on her chest felt somehow lighter than it had in years. The parking lot stood empty beneath the harsh glow of street lamps, rain beginning to fall in a gentle mist that caught the light like scattered diamonds. Emily Carter clutched her single grocery bag, now lighter than planned, and fumbled for her keys as the automatic doors of Parkside Grocery hissed closed behind her. The evening air carried the first bite of winter, a reminder that soon there would be heating bills to add to her mounting concerns. A few spaces away, Tom Reynolds struggled with his bags, his arthritic fingers working methodically against the slick plastic handles. The brown paper bag, now reinforced with his groceries, seemed to weigh heavily in his arms, not just with physical contents, but with the burden of accepting help when pride had been your compass for decades. Emily hesitated, watching as a gallon of milk teetered precariously at the top of his bag. Without thinking, she changed direction, her worn sneakers splashing through a shallow puddle as she approached. "Let me help you with those, Mr. Reynolds." Tom straightened immediately, his military bearing asserting itself like an old reflex. "Thank you kindly, ma'am, but I can manage." His voice carried the polite firmness of a man who had survived circumstances unimaginable to most. Yet there was something in his eyes, a flicker of uncertainty perhaps, that betrayed his words. "I'm headed this way anyhow." Emily lied gently, nodding toward the row of vehicles beyond his truck. The rain began to fall more insistently now, droplets catching in Tom's silver hair like a crown of tiny stars. He relented with a short nod, allowing Emily to steady the bag as they walked in companionable silence toward his vehicle, a faded red pickup truck from another era, its paint dulled by years, but its chrome polished to a military shine. "You didn't have to do that back there," Tom said finally as they reached the truck, his voice soft but clear against the patter of rain. "In the store. Not everyone would step up like that." Emily's hand instinctively moved to the wedding ring hanging from the chain around her neck. "My husband, James," her voice caught slightly on his name, still sharp-edged after all this time. "He always said that the measure of a society isn't how it treats its strongest members, but how it remembers those who gave everything to protect it." Tom's weathered face softened, the rigid lines of discipline giving way to something more vulnerable. "He sounds like he was a good Marine." "The best," Emily replied, her smile genuine despite the familiar ache. "Afghanistan, 3 tours. He came home to us each time until—" She didn't need to finish. The understanding in Tom's eyes told her. He knew too well how that sentence ended. Tom placed his groceries carefully in the passenger seat of his truck, then turned to face Emily fully. Rain streamed down his face now, but he made no move to wipe it away or seek shelter. "Mrs. Carter, I've been on this earth long enough to know when someone is giving from an empty cup." His gaze was direct, unflinching. "You didn't have money to spare back there." Emily shook her head slightly, rain dampening her hair. "My husband was a Marine. I know how much veterans have given for us. It was the least I could do." Something shifted in Tom's expression, a recognition perhaps of the unique fellowship that exists between those who have served and the families who stand behind them. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, pressing it firmly into Emily's palm. "My lucky coin," he explained. "Carried it through 2 tours in Vietnam. Maybe it can carry some luck to you now." Emily glanced down at the worn challenge coin in her hand, its edges smoothed by decades of worried fingers. "I can't accept this." "You already have," Tom said simply, his tone brooking no argument. He extended his hand, and Emily took it, feeling the strength that remained in his grip despite the years. "Semper Fi, Mrs. Carter. Semper Fi," she echoed softly. They parted ways then, two strangers connected by a moment of grace, neither expecting their paths to cross again. Emily watched as Tom's truck rumbled to life, its headlights cutting through the thickening rain before disappearing around the corner. A brief encounter already fading into memory, like ripples on water returning to stillness. "Final notice." The words glared up at Emily from the kitchen table, harsh red letters stamped across the envelope she'd been avoiding for days. Rain lashed against the windows of the small apartment, matching the storm brewing inside her chest as she stood frozen in the dim light. Her grocery bag, lighter than planned after helping Tom, sat forgotten by her feet, a carton of milk and a few essentials that wouldn't stretch nearly far enough. The letter wasn't alone. It sat atop a mountain of similar envelopes, each one a weight pressing down on her shoulders. Electric bill, phone bill, Jake's school fees, and now the one that made her stomach twist into knots. An eviction notice. 60 days to find a new place to live, a new beginning they couldn't afford. Emily sank into a kitchen chair, her rain-dampened hair still clinging to her neck. The apartment was quiet save for the soft hum of the refrigerator, a sound that suddenly seemed precious, temporary. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for the eviction notice, the paper crinkling beneath her grip. The landlord's reasoning was simple. The building was being converted to luxury condos. Progress, they called it. To Emily, it was just another door closing. The weight of Tom's challenge coin pressed against her palm, still nestled in her pocket where she'd placed it after their goodbye. She pulled it out now, turning it over in her hands, wondering what battles the small metal disc had witnessed. What would James have done in this situation? The question haunted her most nights as she stared at the ceiling, exhaustion pulling at her body while her mind raced through impossible calculations. "Mom?" Jake's voice startled her from her thoughts. He stood in the hallway, pajama-clad and sleepy-eyed, his dark hair, so like his father's, sticking up at odd angles. "Is that dinner?" He nodded toward the forgotten grocery bag. Emily quickly swept the bills into a pile, sliding them under a cookbook with practiced efficiency. "Yes, sweetie, just some soup and sandwiches tonight. How was Mrs. Wilson's?" Jake shrugged, his 8-year-old shoulders carrying a seriousness no child should possess. "Fine. She let me watch TV after I finished my homework." His eyes, perceptive, beyond his years, drifted to the cookbook hiding the bills. Are those more money papers? Emily's heart constricted. When had her son learned to see through her so easily? When had he started carrying worries that should have been hers alone? She patted the chair beside her, and Jake climbed up, his small frame fitting against her side like he was made to be there. "Just some grown-up stuff," she said, forcing brightness into her voice. "Nothing for you to worry about." "Dad used to say that too," Jake said quietly, picking at a loose thread on his sleeve. "When he was going away, he'd say it was just grown-up stuff, but I knew he was going somewhere dangerous." The comparison struck Emily like a physical blow. How many times had James sat at this very table, trying to shield their son from fears too heavy for small shoulders? And how many times had Jake seen through that shield, intuiting the gravity behind his father's casual words? "Mrs. Wilson's grandson has to move schools," Jake continued, his voice small in the quiet kitchen, "because they can't stay in their apartment anymore. Are we going to have to move too?" Emily's fingers found the challenge coin again, its edges worn smooth. By decades of worried hands that had survived their own impossible circumstances. She thought of Tom Reynolds standing tall despite his struggles, of James facing danger with steady resolve. There might be some changes coming, she admitted, choosing her words carefully. But you know what your dad always used to say, Carters. Bend but never break, we'll figure it out together. Promise? Jake asked, his eyes searching hers for reassurance she wasn't sure she could honestly give. Emily pulled him close, breathing in the scent of his hair, a mixture of shampoo and the innocent smell that was uniquely her son. Outside, the rain continued its relentless drumming, and somewhere in the building a door slammed, the sound echoing through walls too thin to keep the world at bay. I promise, she whispered, the words a prayer as much as a vow. Everything will be okay. But as Jake's breathing steadied against her side, Emily stared at the hidden pile of bills and wondered how much longer she could keep that promise. Silence filled the small apartment as Tom Reynolds sat in his weathered recliner, the springs creaking beneath him like old memories stirring to life. The grocery bags from earlier sat on his kitchen counter, their contents: bread, milk, canned. Soup and medicine he could now afford because of a stranger's kindness, still unpacked. Rain tapped against the single window, nature's gentle reminder that he wasn't completely alone in the world. His arthritis-gnarled fingers turned the photograph frame in his lap, the glass reflecting the dim glow of the single lamp beside him. The image, faded at the edges but treasured beyond measure, showed a young Marine in dress blues, standing proud beside a smiling woman in a simple white dress. Their faces radiated with hope, with dreams still unbroken by what war and time would eventually take. 52 years, Margaret, he whispered to the empty room, his voice rough with emotions rarely given voice. 52 years since we stood there, and 30 since you've been gone. The grocery receipt lay on the side table, the total circled. In pen, $12.47 short, the exact amount Emily Carter had paid without hesitation. The woman's face appeared in his mind, the determined set of her jaw, the exhaustion hiding behind her kind eyes, the wedding ring hanging from a chain around her neck instead of on her finger, a detail his military-trained observation hadn't missed. When had someone last stepped forward for him like that? Tom's mind traveled back through the lonely corridors of recent years. Neighbors offered perfunctory nods when they passed in the hallway. The VA clinic staff were professional but distant. His regiment buddies, those still alive, were scattered across the country, their bonds maintained through Christmas cards that grew fewer each year. Tom pushed himself up from the chair with effort, joints protesting as he made his way to the kitchen drawer where he kept important papers. The challenge coin, his lucky charm through 2 tours, was gone now, resting instead in the hands of a young widow who had less than he did but had given anyway. He rummaged through the drawer until he found what he was looking for, a small leather address book, its pages yellowed with age. Inside, in his meticulous handwriting, were names and contact information for people who had mattered in his life. Some entries were crossed out now, marking passages from this world to the next. But one name remained clear, unmarked by time's relentless march, Colonel Robert Winters. They had served together in Vietnam, and unlike Tom, Robert had stayed in, climbing ranks, building connections. Last Tom heard, Robert was involved with veterans advocacy in the city, pulling strings for those who had served but been forgotten. Tom's gaze drifted back to the groceries. Emily Carter's sacrifice sitting on his counter while he had a refrigerator already stocked with enough food for the week. The unfairness of it struck him with sudden clarity. He had lived his life, had his career, his love, his time in the sun. That young woman was still fighting her battles, raising a child alone, working herself to exhaustion, honoring a fallen. Marine by helping another. Not this time, Margaret, he said aloud, straightening his back with determination. Not on my watch. The old rotary phone sat heavy in his hand as he dialed, each number a deliberate choice, each ring bringing him closer to action rather than mere existence. It had been years since he'd asked for anything. Pride and independence were hallmarks of his generation, but this wasn't for him. "Robert, Tom Reynolds here." His voice found its command tone, unused for decades but not forgotten. "I need a favor, a big one." As he explained about Emily, about her small kindness with enormous implications, about the son being raised without a father, Tom felt something long dormant awakening in his chest. A sense of purpose, a mission, the receipt. On the table caught his eye again. $12.47. Such a small amount to change the course of multiple lives. Because Tom understood something that perhaps Emily herself didn't yet realize. Sometimes the smallest actions revealed the truest character, and character like hers deserved more than struggles and eviction notices. "I understand. It's a lot to ask," Tom concluded, his free hand closing around the empty space where his challenge coin had rested for decades. "But she's the widow of one of our own." The response from the other end of the line made the old Marine smile for the first time in months. "No, sir," he replied, voice steady with newfound determination. "She has no idea what's coming." "Mom, there are soldiers outside!" Jake's voice pierced through Emily's exhausted slumber, jerking her from the first deep sleep she'd managed in days. For a moment, confusion clouded her mind. Memories of another morning, years ago when uniformed. Men had arrived bearing news that had shattered her world into irreparable pieces. The clock read 6:47 a.m. She'd fallen asleep on the couch after her late shift. Bills still scattered across the coffee table where she'd been trying to determine which ones she could postpone without losing essentials. The eviction notice lay on top, its deadline a looming shadow over every calculation. "Jake, what are you talking about?" Emily pushed herself upright, her muscles protesting after too few hours of rest. The apartment was filled with the pale blue light of early morning, making everything seem slightly unreal, like a dream not fully formed. Jake stood at the window, small hands pressed against the glass, his breath creating fog circles that expanded and contracted with each excited exhalation. "Look, there are like 100 of them." The low rumble of engines finally registered in Emily's consciousness, a deep, mechanical growl that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the building. Not the familiar hum of morning traffic or garbage trucks, but something more deliberate, more commanding. Emily joined her son at the window, her heart suddenly pounding with inexplicable apprehension. The sight below stole her breath away. The narrow street in front of their apartment building was filled with military vehicles, 3 large transport trucks and several smaller jeeps, their olive-green paint gleaming dully in the morning light. Each bore the unmistakable emblem of the United States Marine Corps. Men and women in dress blues were emerging from the vehicles with military precision, their movements synchronized as though rehearsed 1,000 times. "Jake, stay here," Emily whispered, her mind racing. Was there some kind of emergency in the neighborhood? A training exercise gone off course? She grabbed her robe, cinching it tightly around her waist as she moved toward the door. The hallway outside her apartment was eerily quiet, as though the entire building was holding its breath in collective surprise. Emily's hand trembled slightly as she unlocked the deadbolt, pulling the door open just as knuckles were raised to knock. Before her stood a Marine officer, his uniform immaculate, ribbons and medals creating a tapestry of service and sacrifice. Across his chest, the golden eagle, globe and anchor gleamed on his cap, catching the hallway light. Behind him stood 2 more Marines, their posture perfect, faces composed but somehow kind. "Mrs. Emily Carter," the officer's voice was deep, authoritative, but gentler than she expected. Emily nodded, unable to find her voice, her fingers instinctively reaching for James's wedding ring hanging from her neck, a reflexive gesture whenever military uniforms appeared in her life. "Colonel Robert Winters, ma'am, United States Marine Corps." He removed his cover, tucking it precisely under his arm in a gesture of respect. "May we come in? We have a matter of importance to discuss with you." Emily's mind whirled with possibilities, each more confusing than the last. Had they discovered something about James's death? Was there some pension issue, some paperwork that needed addressing? "There are so many of you," she managed, glancing past him toward the stairwell where more uniformed figures waited. A small smile touched the colonel's face. "Yes, ma'am. The Marine Corps believes in showing up in force when one of our own needs acknowledgement." His eyes held hers with unwavering certainty. "Or when the family of one of our own shows extraordinary kindness to a veteran in need." Emily's breath caught. Tom Reynolds, the grocery store. The challenge coin still sat on her nightstand where she'd placed it the night before, its weight somehow comforting, despite the burdens crushing her from all sides. "Mom?" Jake appeared at her side, his eyes wide with wonder at the assembled uniforms. "Are they here about Dad?" Colonel Winters knelt down to Jake's level, his movement fluid despite the formality of his uniform. "Young man, we're here because your mother did something very special, and Marines never forget those who honor their own." He straightened, addressing Emily once more. "Mrs. Carter, would you and your son please join us outside? There's someone who would like to thank you properly." Outside, through the morning mist, Emily could make out a familiar figure standing beside the lead vehicle, an elderly man in a pressed suit, his posture military straight despite his years. Tom Reynolds stood waiting, his weathered face holding, an expression she couldn't quite read, part gratitude, part triumph, and something else altogether, something like justice. "Mrs. Carter." The officer who stepped forward wasn't Colonel Winters, but another man, taller, older, with an air of command that seemed to part the very molecules of air around him. His uniform bore more stars than Emily had ever seen up close, gleaming in the morning light like constellations against the dark blue fabric. "I'm General Mark Anderson, United States Marine Corps." Emily stood frozen on the apartment steps, Jake's small hand clutched in hers. The morning dew still clung to the grass, and her bare feet had grown cold against the concrete, but she barely noticed. The world had narrowed to this impossible moment. Dozens of Marines standing at attention in her modest neighborhood, neighbors peering curiously from windows, and Tom Reynolds watching it all with quiet dignity from beside the lead vehicle. "General?" she managed, the word barely audible above the idle rumble of military engines. "Yes, ma'am." His voice carried easily across the space between them, deep and assured. "I apologize for the early hour and the dramatic entrance, but when a Medal of Honor recipient makes a personal request, the Corps listens." Emily's gaze snapped to Tom, who stood straighter now, as though the general's words had physically transformed him. Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration, awarded for valor beyond the call of duty. Her father had taken her to a ceremony once, when she was a child. She remembered the hush that had fallen over the crowd when the recipient walked past, as though witnessing something sacred. "I don't understand," Emily said, looking between the general and Tom. General Anderson gestured, and Tom approached, his steps measured and deliberate. Up close, Emily could see he was wearing his own medals now, a modest row that included the distinctive blue ribbon and gold star of the Medal of Honor. "Mrs. Carter," Tom began, his weathered face solemn. "I didn't properly introduce myself at the grocery store. Staff Sergeant Thomas J. Reynolds, 1st Marine Division, Vietnam." I led a rescue operation in 1968 that brought back 17 wounded Marines from behind enemy lines. The president hung this medal around my neck in 1970. He touched the blue ribbon briefly, almost reverently, before continuing. For 50 years, I've carried the weight of being called a hero when I was just doing what any Marine would do for his brothers. But 2 days ago, in that grocery store, I witnessed true courage. A young woman with barely enough for herself, stepping forward to help a stranger. Emily shook her head slightly, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. It was just $12, Mr. Reynolds. Tom, he corrected gently. And it wasn't about the money. It was about your heart. After you helped me, I made some calls. Found out you're the widow of Captain James Carter. Learned about your situation. A cold knot formed in Emily's stomach. You've been checking up on me. General Anderson stepped forward. With all due respect, Mrs. Carter, Staff Sergeant Reynolds contacted me directly. Said he'd met the widow of one of our finest, and she was facing eviction while still honoring what the Corps stands for. The General and I served together, Tom explained. Different wars, same values. He agreed that the Marines take care of their own, and that includes the families left behind. Jake tugged at Emily's hand, his voice pitched with childish urgency. Mom, is that man really a hero? Tom knelt down, meeting Jake at eye level despite the protest of aging joints. Your father was the real hero, son. I just had the luck to come home. He looked up at Emily, his eyes bright with emotion. When I found out you were Captain Carter's widow, that you were working 2 jobs and still facing eviction, I couldn't stand by. Not when I have connections and resources that could help. Emily felt tears threatening, her throat tightening with emotion she couldn't afford to release. I don't need charity, Mr. Reynolds. Tom, we're managing. This isn't charity, General. Anderson interjected, his tone gentle but firm. This is the Corps fulfilling its promise to its own. Your husband gave everything for his country. The least we can do is ensure his family doesn't face these struggles alone. He gestured toward the convoy, where Marines were now unloading equipment and supplies. Staff Sergeant Reynolds has arranged something special. With your permission, we'd like to proceed. Emily looked at Tom. Not just a veteran down on his luck as she'd assumed, but a decorated hero who had used his influence to mobilize this response. His expression held no pity, only understanding and something that looked remarkably like respect. Why? She whispered. The question meant only for him. Tom's answer was equally quiet, meant for her alone. Because sometimes the ones who deserve help the most are the last ones to ask for it. For you! General Anderson extended a cream-colored envelope toward Emily, its weight somehow disproportionate to its size, as though it contained more than mere paper. The morning had warmed slightly, but Emily still shivered in her robe, her bare feet numb against the concrete steps. Behind her, the apartment building stood silent, the eviction notice waiting inside like a ticking clock, counting down the seconds of her family's security. Emily hesitated, her fingers hovering over the envelope. What is this? Open it, Tom encouraged, his weathered face gentle but expectant. Around them, the Marines stood at parade rest, a wall of blue uniforms and disciplined silence. In the distance, a school bus rumbled past, children's faces pressing against windows to witness the extraordinary scene unfolding on the ordinary street. With trembling fingers, Emily broke the seal and withdrew several documents, official letterhead. Gleaming in the morning light, her eyes scanned the first page, catching phrases that seemed to float off the paper. Marine Corps Fallen Heroes Foundation. Housing Assistance, Educational Fund. Immediate disbursement. I don't understand. she whispered, the papers shaking visibly in her hand. Colonel Winters stepped forward. Mrs. Carter, the Fallen Heroes Foundation provides support to families of Marines who made the ultimate sacrifice. Your husband's service entitled you to benefits you apparently never received. His eyes held a mix of respect and regret. The system failed you, but Staff Sergeant Reynolds made sure we found you. These funds will cover your housing needs, not just the back rent, but a new place if you choose, and establish an educational trust for Jake, General Anderson continued, his authoritative voice somehow softer now. Captain Carter's sacrifice deserves no less than our complete support for his family. Jake pressed against Emily's side, his small fingers intertwining with hers. Is this about Dad? He asked, his voice small but clear, in the hushed morning air. Yes, young man, the general answered, kneeling to meet Jake's eyes despite the crispness of his uniform. Your father was a hero who protected his country and his fellow Marines. Now it's our turn to protect you. Emily's vision blurred as she stared at the figures on the document, numbers that represented liberation from the crushing weight she'd carried for years. No more choosing between electricity and groceries, no more second shifts that kept her from tucking her son into bed. No more failing at the one promise she'd made to James, that she would keep their family safe. There's something else, Tom said, stepping closer. From inside his jacket, he produced another envelope, this one smaller and less official. The Veterans Assistance Center downtown needs an administrative director, someone who understands both the military life and the struggles families face. He held her gaze steadily. I told them I knew exactly the right person. Emily's hand flew to her mouth, emotions she couldn't name cascading through her body. A job, but you barely know me. I know enough, Tom replied simply. I know you work 2 jobs and still help strangers. I know you're raising a fine young man who will grow up understanding what service really means. And I know Captain Carter would be proud of the woman standing before us today. A tear escaped, trailing down Emily's cheek before she could catch it. For years, she had held herself together with determination and silent prayers, never allowing the cracks to show, especially in front of Jake. But here, surrounded by the brotherhood her husband had given his life for, something inside her finally yielded. I can't accept all this, she managed, her voice catching on the words. General Anderson shook his head, the morning light glinting off the stars on his shoulders. With all due respect, Mrs. Carter, you already earned it. The moment. Your husband took the oath. The Corps made a promise to both of you. We're just making good on that promise, a bit late perhaps, but Marines always complete the mission. The world seemed to tilt beneath Emily's feet, past and future realigning into something she hadn't dared imagine. Jake's hand tightened in hers, anchoring her to the present moment even as possibilities unfurled before her like roads she'd thought forever closed. Thank you, she whispered, the words wholly inadequate for the tide of gratitude washing through her. Her eyes found Tom's, seeing in them not pity, but profound understanding, the recognition between 2 souls who had carried burdens largely unseen by the world around them. The elderly veteran nodded once, a gesture that somehow conveyed everything. Words could not. His lucky coin, still in Emily's possession, had changed hands, and with it the current of fortune that had run counter to her life for so long. Ready? Tom Reynolds stood on the sidewalk, his weathered hand resting gently on Jake's shoulder. The boy nodded, excitement radiating from him like sunlight. Emily remained frozen a few steps behind them, her heart pounding against her ribs. 3 days had passed since the Marines had appeared outside her apartment. 3 days of paperwork, phone calls, and assurances that felt too good to be true. Now Tom had asked them to meet him here, at an address in a quiet neighborhood she'd never visited before. The modest two-story house before them was surrounded by vehicles, trucks, cars, and even a few motorcycles with veteran license plates. The sound of hammers, drills, and good-natured shouting drifted from the backyard. The American flag hung proudly from a porch column, fluttering in the gentle breeze. "What is this place?" Emily asked, her voice barely audible above the activity. Tom's eyes crinkled at the corners, a smile spreading across his face. "This, Mrs. Carter, is your new home." Before Emily could process his words, the front door swung open. General Anderson stepped onto the porch, now dressed in civilian clothes, but still carrying himself with unmistakable military bearing. Behind him emerged a stream of people, Marines in work clothes instead of uniforms, local veterans with VFW caps, and townspeople Emily recognized from the grocery store, the school, and the diner where she'd worked. "Mrs. Carter," the general called, descending the steps. "I hope you don't mind, but we took some liberties with your housing situation." Emily's legs felt suddenly weak. "I don't understand." "The foundation doesn't just write checks," Tom explained, his voice gentle. "When one of our own needs help, we show up. The house belonged to a Marine colonel who passed last year. His family donated it to the foundation." He gestured toward the bustling activity. "These folks have been working round the clock to make it ready for you and Jake." Jake tugged at Emily's hand, his eyes wide. "Is this really ours, Mom?" Before she could answer, Frank, her former manager from the diner, approached, wiping paint from his hands. "Emily, when that old Marine came into the restaurant asking about you, none of us realized what he was setting in motion." He looked almost sheepish. "The whole town wanted to help once we heard the story." Emily felt the world tilting beneath her feet. These people, some she knew by name, others complete strangers, had come together for her family. The thought was too enormous to comprehend. "Come see inside," a female Marine urged, gently taking Emily's elbow. "We've got the kitchen all set up." In a daze, Emily allowed herself to be guided through the front door. The interior was simple but beautiful. Freshly painted walls, polished hardwood floors, furniture that somehow looked both new and perfectly at home in the space. Photos she recognized from her apartment had been carefully arranged on the mantel, alongside James's service commendations in new frames. "This is the living room," the female Marine continued, her voice warm with pride. "And through there is the dining room. We found a table big enough for holiday gatherings." Holiday gatherings. The words struck Emily like physical blows. For years, holidays had been quiet, sometimes somber affairs, just her and Jake making the best of things. The thought of filling a dining room with laughter and friendship seemed like something from another lifetime. Jake had already disappeared upstairs, his excited voice calling down about his room, about a desk for homework, about space for his books. Emily followed the sound, climbing stairs that now belonged to her family, that would carry their footsteps for years to come. The bedroom at the top of the stairs stole her breath. A queen-sized bed with a handmade quilt, a dresser with a jewelry box, and on the wall James's photograph, the one that had traveled with them from apartment to apartment, a silent witness to their struggles. As Emily stood transfixed, a line of Marines filed into the room, followed by veterans of different ages and branches of service. Without a word, they formed a row before James's photograph. General Anderson stepped forward, his movement bringing Emily back to the present moment. "Captain James Carter," he said, his voice resonant with respect, "your sacrifice has not been forgotten. Your family is our family now." As one, the Marines snapped to attention, rendering a perfect salute to the smiling young man in the photograph. Jake stood watching, his small chest swelling with pride, his back straightening unconsciously to mirror the Marines honoring his father. Emily's vision blurred as tears welled and spilled. For years, she had carried the weight of her family's future alone, a solitary figure against mounting odds. But looking around now at the faces of these strangers turned allies, these professionals turned friends. She realized the truth that had eluded her since James's death. She had never truly been alone, and now, surrounded by the community her simple act of kindness had somehow awakened, she never would be again. It started with $12. Tom Reynolds stood at the podium, his Medal of Honor gleaming against his suit jacket. Behind him, a banner read, "Veterans Family Support Center, Grand Opening." The crowd gathered on the sunlit lawn included Marines in dress blues, local veterans, townspeople, and dozens of military families, each with stories of struggle and resilience etched in their eyes. 6 months had passed since that morning when Emily Carter had found Marines on her doorstep. 6 months of transformation, of healing, of building something new from the fragments of a broken life. $12, Tom continued, his weathered voice carrying across the hushed gathering. That's what Mrs. Carter spent on a stranger's groceries when she barely had enough for herself. She didn't know who I was, didn't know what might come of it. She just saw someone in need and stepped forward. Emily sat in the front row, Jake beside her in a crisp button-down shirt, his hair neatly combed for the occasion. Her hands rested on a folder containing the day's agenda, her first official event as Director of Family Services for the new center. In my 40 years since Vietnam, I've been called a hero more times than I can count. But true heroism isn't always found on battlefields. Tom's eyes found Emily's in the crowd. Sometimes it's found in grocery stores, in small kindnesses that ask for nothing in return. He gestured toward the renovated building behind him. Once an abandoned community center, now a lifeline for veterans and their families. This center exists because one person reminded me that people still care, that the world hasn't forgotten what sacrifice means. His voice softened. You reminded me that I wasn't alone, Emily. Now it's our turn to make sure no veteran's family ever feels alone again. As applause rippled through the crowd, Emily recalled her own journey. From the desperate woman counting pennies at the checkout counter to someone who now helped others navigate the systems and support they deserved. The memory of her darkest days made the light of the present moment shine brighter. When the ceremony concluded, Tom found her amid the mingling crowd. He pressed something small and metal into her palm, his lucky coin, the one he'd given her that rainy night months ago. I think you should keep this, Emily said, trying to return it. Tom shook his head, closing her fingers around the coin. It served its purpose. Besides, he smiled, you're the one who reminded me of the most important lesson. Kindness is never wasted, it multiplies. As families gathered around tables of food, sharing stories and building connections, Emily watched Jake playing with other children who understood what it meant to miss a parent who had served. The emptiness James had left would never be completely filled, but the space around it had expanded to hold new purpose, new community, new hope. One act of kindness, one moment of reaching beyond her own struggle. That's all it had taken to change not just her life, but countless others. And perhaps, somewhere, someone watching would be inspired to do the same.